Hi Sushma.
Hi.
Welcome to a series on CSO leaders.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Sudhir.
Sushma, I was just saying that you did your masters in literature from MS University Baroda, and then you went out to Cornell to do a masters in development communication, and then you came back to work with women at the grassroots in Gujarat. So, did you have that in mind even before you went, or how did it happen? What was the inspiration of coming back and working at grassroots?
Yes, I went with the idea of coming back. And despite great fears by my parents and everybody thinking that that's where I'm going to be. But when I was studying literature, Masters of Literature, and I was fortunate to have had a very good faculty and some very inspiring teachers. I studied a lot of Russian literature.
Russian?
Yes, in English.
Right.
It was English literature.
Yes.
But that period, I think, was a period when it was an interesting period in India. Now, when I look back, the early 80s.
80s, right.
And when there was a lot of ferment within students, the women's movement was just coming into being in India, in the urban areas. You would see a lot of films, a lot of those iconic Shyam Benegal films were in those period.
Right.
So there was a new consciousness growing, and as young students and teenagers, one was suffused with that too. And literature, now when I look back, I think maybe that time I didn't make the connections or connect the dots as well. Literature actually creates a compassion. Good literature actually creates compassion. It's all about actually looking at society.
Yes.
Most literature is actually is an expression and record of your time. So I think my interest in actually wanting to do something with women, wanting to, the great anger on the patriarchal world that we lived in, and wanting to change that and wanting to do that was, I think, growing in that period, maybe from high school. But somehow I felt literature was limiting. It didn't train me to actually jump into activism. And that's when I actually moved to do the next course and program, thinking that maybe if I train myself into a kind of more journalistic mode, then I would be able to start responding to that. And that's how I actually went abroad. Whatever it turned out to be, but I think there I got more trained, more influenced, greater exposure to a more evolved understanding of gender issues. So while the course was development communication, I actually did much more of gender studies and political economy, and that's when, in fact, I got more determined that I can now come back and do something and work with communities directly and work with women.
So what were some of your initial challenges? I think, were you considered as part of the local setup?
No.
Or what were your initial challenges to kind of get this going?
Well, of course, the first challenge was that I began my work right on the border. Kutch is a border, but even within Kutch, I was wanting to focus right on the border of India and Pakistan, the villages, actually the last civilian points.
Oh, I see.
And so that was new, that was a challenge, because first challenge was trust. People on the border don't trust easily. There was a lot of suspicion. There were also a lot of things happening. At those years, there was quite a lot of smuggling happening. So they didn't know who this was. In fact, I was tested in a lot of places because of my short hair and my slim body. They would look at me and they say, "Acha, ye to basically आदमी है, intelligence का आदमी है, लेकिन औरत की तरह dress करके आए." The more substantive and long-term challenges was just getting women out of their homes, which is quite common across the country. But these were because they were remote, they were border areas. There were also communities who were fairly conservative. Women were not necessarily would come out very easily, even under normal circumstances. They would not really leave their village. So under those circumstances, we would ask them to come out, get into trainings, get into a bus. So those were all the initial challenges of breaking through the mistrust of the men as to what we are going to do with the women. And then of course the main big challenge and find their own identity,
right.
To be able to slowly take on their own immediate, the patriarchy that they were surrounded with initially, their own families, and that's always the most difficult for anybody.
Right.
You can take on the world, but you don't really take on your families very easily.
But would you want to share some of your early successes, some great hurrahs where you felt that
the world had changed?
No, it kind of strengthened your resolve to kind of see that things can happen, can change.
Yes, I think there were many of these kind of milestones in the journey, and I think the earlier milestones were a lot to do with women who, where we really got them to start looking at their ecological resources, their environmental resources, their land, their water issues, and that was a realm which women hadn't got into, though they bore the brunt of the problem, of course, of the droughts in this case, and therefore the lack of water, the complete dependence on rain for their crops and the rain-fed crops. So rain, clouds, water is the determining factor in their lives, but they had no influence over it, and they had no decision-making space at all for this. So I think that was an interesting milestone when we realized that for women's lives to really get transformed internally, in their private space, if the power dynamics within the home and the family had to change,
right.
Then they first had to get into the public space and take on issues which actually determined the power equation between the regions and other regions, because of lack of water. So for them to really get into and engage with the land, where women are normally kept out of looking at those issues, and they were carriers of a deep knowledge system which nobody had listened to, because they are constantly engaging with the land and the biodiversity of the region, but they were not the decision makers. So getting them into that space, the kind of dynamics that unleashed, which even we did not anticipate, and in '98 was almost 10 years after we began, was when we initiated a community radio program.
Oh, okay.
And that was probably one of the first community radio programs in the country we started, which was run entirely by the women's collectives, and a lot of their stories, their success stories, their struggles, their issues was scripted, and it became a full 1-year episodic serial on All India Radio, which was actually so it was, they had their own studio, but they were not broadcasting, they were not narrowcasting, they were broadcasting through the All India Radio. And that became so popular, that serial, which was actually giving voice to their issues.
Fantastic.
That the district demanded that it should run for 1 more year, and that they would finance it.
Okay.
Villages and communities, and so that was a high for the group, because it took their stories across the region and beyond.
Right.
And also it triggered a whole interest in community radio movement across the country. 2001 was a dateline in our region because of the earthquake, and that changed many things for many of us and many of the communities, and created a lot of opportunities, but it also changed, it broke a lot of, it broke both, it broke a lot of things which had got built. I'm not talking only physically, but it also broke a lot of barriers.
I see.
Yeah, and disasters do that, because when calamities come, they are so defining in people's lives that in a sense they become an equalizer to some extent, and therefore it allows you to start redefining your own boundaries and lives in very different ways. Kutch did become a fairly known case study of a good rehabilitation that happened, and a process where there was a very deep collaboration between all stakeholders, the private players, civil society players, and the state.
How do you see the scale now? I mean, do you see the scale of the problem is lesser, more manageable?
Which problem?
Of this women being part of the dialogue and taking up issues on themselves. I think that's where you started. So I thought,
yes,
that's. So do you see that is now more in the realm of manageable? There are more challenges.
I think there are more challenges. I think there are more challenges. It's a cycle. It's okay. I mean, often one tends to say, okay, you know, what happened in the 80s and 90s, the women's movement, no, it was too militant, it was too this. I don't see it that way. I think it was important to create exclusive spaces for women because that was the only way to get out women's expression and to be able to enable them to find themselves, and that's what the women's movement in India did at the rural level, at the urban level. What I think the challenge today is that it's both. You are still living in two worlds. There are women still inside the parda, and nothing has changed for many, many women. But a lot has changed for many women too. Today, it's at an interesting juncture where there are many women who have broken many barriers.
Okay.
But I'm also seeing that breaking external barriers today has become maybe easier. And you find women who, I find them even in the rural areas, who are very expressive, very mobile. These are no longer the real big issues, you know, of them being able to step out or being able to talk or express themselves or counter or take on issues. No, those are not, or be completely still bound. But the inner fear has not necessarily gone, maybe it has increased. And I think the inner demons are always far more difficult to fight. Therefore, challenges for all of us, for the younger generation, for a younger generation of social activists, change makers, is higher.
So what would
and therefore the need for grit and the need to stay with it is actually probably more.
Okay.
You know, in a sense.
So in a sense, I mean, what would you then tell them? I mean, people looking at getting into the development sector, you're saying that they should look at a longer haul stay. They need to be more patient. What is it that?
Yes, absolutely. You need patience. Period. You need patience for transformation. But what I'm finding interesting with the younger generation, and it's great fun working with the younger generation, is the amount of creativity and application they're bringing into looking at problems. The way one is looking at a problem, the way one is addressing it. Of course, the resources that you have on your command is also probably higher.
Right.
But there are many more people who are thinking horizontally. You know, and not vertically on issues, and so that's the good part with the younger generation coming. But I think if one just really remembers this all the time, that to be in a process of change and transformation, especially with the meekest and the weakest and the most vulnerable, actually really changes you. And if you're really serious about changing yourself to just become a better human being, if you have the ability to really put yourself and reflect and watch out and listen, one will be able to do great things, you know, really transform things internally and externally. And I think that's, for today's society, I think that's very important.
So thank you very much, Sushma. It was really useful, and I hope we can all build a more just and equitable society that we are looking to live in. Thank you.
Thank you.